probably won't hear 90% of what you say, right?
I don't know. We'll see what they say.
We got bad news. Friday, Thursday morning, Friday morning, real early. DJ woke up 5 o'clock and Misty passed away.
Is that his? So let's see. His first wife was Marie, was the one. The second one was
Tracy.
Tracy. So this is the third one, the one he just married just recently, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but she had lupus. Doctor told her she probably only had 5 years. So.
How old was she?
She's a year younger than DJ, so she is 44.
So she's my age.
Her birthday was January 21st. But this happened Saturday morning, not
He woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning.
I say it had to have been Saturday since my dad wasn't at work. Because my dad didn't know about it. If it would have been Friday, my dad would have known about it.
Yeah.
Because when David told us yesterday afternoon, my dad didn't know.
yeah, but not that.
How's your mom and dad doing, Sandy?
Better.
That's good.
I think they're finally settling in.
Well, I hear it takes quite some time. You go through peaks and valleys with this for the first 6 months to a year. I was talking to a friend of mine whose his full-time job now is at Memorial Road Church of Christ in Oklahoma City, well, in Edmond, Oklahoma. They have on campus at Oklahoma Christian, they have it goes from assisted live, like more like the villa, all the way to nursing home, all stages in between that are members of the church. And his whole job is just, he ministers to those people. He's one of 3. And that's
Is this on? Yeah. We're gonna go ahead and get started. Let's start with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this time we have to come together and study of your word. Father, there are many that are struggling at this time with sickness and loss and just so many other things that bring trials to our lives, Father. Just pray that you comfort and strengthen them at this time. Be with us now as we enter into study, and thank you for your word and the insight it provides us into your will. Help us always to be doers of your word and not just hearers. In your son's name we pray. Amen. I'm still battling a little bit of congestion. Our family is, so if my voice is not what it usually is, I apologize. Well, let's go to Genesis 24. That's where we're going to be spending our time. Genesis chapter 24. We're still studying the women of the Old Testament. But here in Genesis 24, the broader context is the story of Abraham. But as we enter into 24, Abraham is nearing the end of his life, and he's been blessed by God in every way at this point. But since Abraham is reaching the end of his life, one thing Abraham does is call for one of his servants that was in charge of everything that belonged to him. And he tells his servant to go back to Abraham's original country to find a wife for his son Isaac. Now, in response to this, the servant asked Abraham what should happen if the woman selected to be Isaac's wife does not follow the servant back to the land of Canaan, where these things are taking place. But so Abraham answers that question. He reminds the servant of God's promise to Abraham that he would give him and his descendants the land of Canaan, but also encourages him with the fact that God's angel would go with him, and that if the woman was not willing to follow, the servant would be free from that agreement. Now after these things, the servant makes his journey back to Abraham's homeland, bringing with him his possessions. And at that point, the servant brings the camels, which are among the possessions, to outside the city of Nahor. There's a well of water that's located there, and he asks God that the woman who would give a drink both to the servant and to the camels be the one appointed to be Isaac's wife. That's context. But it's that context that brings us into verse 15, where we read, "Before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, came out with her jar on her shoulder." So here is where the author of Genesis is introducing to his readers for the first time the woman that would become Isaac's wife, Rebekah. Now what we find here in verse 15 is some biographical information about her. And it begins with the fact that she was born to Bethuel. I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, so forgive me for that. But she was the daughter of this person. And we also find that she was the granddaughter of Milcah. Milcah is somebody we read about in Genesis 11, verse 29. We're not going to go there, but this is who she's related to. Now, something else the author shows here is that Rebekah had a connection to Abraham, and that her grandmother Milcah was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. So with that in mind, what's Rebekah's connection to Abraham, according to that statement? What's her relationship, in other words? If you can't see it, that's okay. Okay, so yeah, it's Abraham's niece. More specifically, Abraham would be her great uncle. And by default, Isaac would be her second cousin. So, so that's the relationship that Rebekah has to Abraham. They are family. But in addition to these things, the author concludes here by saying that when Rebecca appears on the scene, she's coming out with her jar on her shoulder. Now, what's she doing when she appears on the scene? She's going to get water. She's coming to this well where Abraham's servant is basically hanging out with his camels, and what he's doing is just waiting to see how the Lord would answer his prayer that he prayed. So the author is showing that even before the servant completed his prayer, the Lord was already answering his prayers. The beginning of that verse says before he had finished speaking. So he hasn't even finished his prayer yet, and God's already answering it accordingly. Questions or comments on verse 15? Okay. So it's these things that set the stage, or if you want to use the word context, that sets the stage for the things we're going to be examining about this next woman we're going to be studying, and that's Rebecca. About Rebecca, we're going to be looking at 4 points. Her story primarily encompasses Genesis chapters 24 through 27, so we're going to spend time in each of those chapters looking at some points about Rebecca. We're not going to fly through the whole of those chapters. We're just going to look at passages from those chapters. From the first point, staying here in Genesis 24, from verse 16, we'll see that she was an attractive woman. From verses 18 and 19 of this chapter, we'll see that she was a generous servant. And then after that, we'll go to chapter 25 and see from verse 23 that she had 2 nations in her womb. And finally, we'll go to chapter 27, and we'll see the role she played in Jacob's deception of Isaac. Now, from these things, we'll see that she was not without her weaknesses. She was a fallible woman. So the application to these things to us is that God still will use fallible people to his glory. So with that in mind, we'll start in verse 16. If somebody wouldn't mind reading that, we're still here in Genesis 24. If somebody wouldn't mind reading verse 16. Thank you, Dean. So here we're going to see the point that she was attractive. Now we see that there pretty much right out the gate. How is she first described? Very beautiful. So it's a very simple point. What we're seeing here is the beginning of a list of some of her physical features. Now, what does it mean when somebody is beautiful? They're attractive to look at. We might say easy on the eyes is one way of putting that. So so with that in mind, the word for beautiful actually here comes from a word that carries with it the idea of something or someone being pleasant or desirable. Here, Rebecca is someone who is physically pleasant or desirable. So that's feature number 1. Next, the text says that she was a virgin. Now, what does it typically mean when somebody's a virgin? Okay, no man. The New American Standard has no man had relations with her, but a better rendition is no man had known her. But yes, she's sexually pure, is the way I put it in my notes. But yes, it is the fact that she had known no man is how that fact is summarized. She had never had any relations with any man at this point in her life. So this further emphasizes the fact that she was a virgin. So that being the case, this third and final physical feature serves to summarize this short list about who she was physically. So that brings us to what the author records in the second part of verse 16. So he's given the physical features, but what is she coming to do there in that second part of the verse? To get water, to fill up her jar, the text reads. So at this point in the verse, the author is beginning to transition into his discussion about what Rebecca would go on to do for Abraham's servant in verses 18 and 19. But this verse started off with the fact that she was beautiful. So as this part of the verse connects with that first part of the verse, this may add to the fact that she was beautiful, not only because of her physical features, but because of this servant attitude that she's beginning to display here. So she also had inner beauty about herself, and we'll touch on that a little bit more. But putting all these things together, the point we should see about Rebecca from verse 16 is that she was attractive. She was an attractive woman. She was attractive physically. And another attractive feature about herself is that she had this attitude of service about her. And that leads to the other things that we read about in her story. Anything else on verse 16? Okay. So that brings us to the next point. We're going to skip verse 17. We'll talk a little bit about it, but we're going to focus on verses 18 and 19, which will be the next point about Rebecca. If somebody wouldn't mind reading those two verses. Thank you, Andrea. So, what we're going to see here is that Rebecca, she was a servant, but also a generous servant. So this point is introduced with the author recording in verse 18. How does she address this servant, first of all? My Lord. Does anyone remember what that term is about? Not only in our relationship to God, but how else is it used? It's a term for master, but even more simply than that, it's a term of respect. So yes, we use it in our relationship with God, our Lord God, but that's not the only way it's used. It's just a term of respect for others. It's the equivalent of our modern expression, sir, when we're addressing a man. So that's how she's addressing this servant. She respects him, probably because of all these possessions of Abraham that he has with him when he comes. But what does she do for him? Gives him water. She says, "Drink, my Lord." So Rebecca is respectfully addressing Abraham's servant. Verse 17, he's asked for this water. He says, "Then the servant ran to meet her and said, 'Please let me drink a little water from your jar.' So she respectfully says, 'Here you go. Drink, my Lord.'" So since Rebecca had this respect for Abraham's servant, the text not only says that she did it, but also says how she did it. It says she quickly lowered her jar. She didn't waste any time. And a lot of this is coming from the respect that she had for this man. So go on to verse 19. What else does she do? Water for the camels as well. And how much water were the camels given? Okay, they drink a lot. So it says until they had finished drinking, is what she says. So she gave them everything they needed from her own jar. This water was typically used to go back to her family, but she's using it to serve this servant and his camels. Now that thought is something that continues on to verse 20, because verse 20 indicates that she continued to draw water for the servant's camels until those camels were completely satisfied. But yes, that's something we know about camels. They drink a lot of water when they have that opportunity. But we're looking at Rebecca, putting verses 18 and 19. What we're seeing here is that she was a generous servant. She was out to serve. Now what she does here is also an answer to the servant's prayer from earlier in the context. He prayed for this kind of woman. We already saw in verse 15 that God already answered this prayer before he'd even finished praying the prayer. So she offers to give a drink not only to Abraham's servant, but also to his camels. Now, in addition to that, if we were to read on into verse 21, we would see that Abraham's servant is taking notice of these things. He's studying her, is what he's doing. And he does that, according to verse 21, for the purpose of determining if the Lord had made his journey successful or not. Because the purpose of this journey, again, was to find a wife for Isaac. Anything else on these verses, questions or comments? Yep. She was she was very kind and sweet. And that's a good observation of the text. The man had not specifically requested to water the camels. He only asked for himself, so she did this by her own choice. So that brings us into our second point about Rebekah. We're going to jump ahead to Genesis 25 and look at verse 23. Again, that's Genesis 25, verse 23, if somebody wouldn't mind reading that. Are you in verse 23 of 25? Okay. We're in chapter 25 and verse 23. I'm going to close these doors. There's a lot of noise coming through here. Oh. Okay. All right, thank you, Andrea. The point we're going to be looking at here about Rebekah is that she would give birth to two nations. Now, what we're reading here is a statement from God. It can be broken down into four parts, but what's the first thing he tells her there in that first line? Two nations are in your womb. So what are nations? Big groups of people. Here in the United States, we are a nation because we're this giant group of people that are all collectively Americans, for lack of a better term. But just to give this verse a little bit of context, what brings us to this point is the fact that after Rebekah was brought back to Isaac, they're married. She experiences a period of barrenness, after which in verse 21 of this chapter, Isaac prayed on Rebekah's behalf, and God allows her to conceive. Now, following these things, in verse 22 of this chapter, the author records that the children she had conceived, they're struggling together within her womb. She's having twins, but Rebekah's asking, why then am I this way? Why is this going on? Now, I don't know what that feels like. I don't know what it feels like to be pregnant, but I certainly don't know what it would feel like to have twins in your womb that are basically fighting with each other. But she's asking this question, why then am I this way? So she goes to God in prayer, and we have God's response here in verse 23. But the first thing God says, two nations are in your womb. Does this literally mean there's these giant group of people, or what does it mean that there's two nations in your womb? Okay, so yes, these are two sons that are going to be the source of two different groups of people, these two nations. Now, from later in Genesis, we find out that these two groups of people were the nations of Edom and Israel. So it's for this reason that in the second part of his statement, God says to Rebekah, two peoples will be separated from your body. So we have the word nations, now we have the word peoples, which kind of narrows it down a little bit. That's just two groups of people. God says it would be separated from her body. Now, in context, these two children that Rebekah had in her womb would eventually separate from each other and become their own separate nations of people. So then we have the third part of the third line, I should say. God goes on to say to Rebekah that as a result of being separated from each other, one people would be stronger than the other. Now, what does that mean? One people shall be stronger than the other. Okay, they would have control over the other. We're going to see that also in the last line. But what else does it mean for one person to be stronger than the other? In other words, what does it mean when you're stronger than somebody else? Rephrasing it a little bit. Okay, you can overtake. You're more powerful, we might say. So, the picture being painted in this part of the verse is that one nation of the two children would be superior to the other. From later in Genesis, we find that since this is true, this is part of the conflict that would exist between Rebekah's two children, Jacob and Esau, or the two. So that being that one people would be stronger than the other, what's going to be the end result based on that fourth line? The older is going to be serving the younger one. Okay, why is that backwards? You could put it that way. Yeah, so in typical fashion, the oldest of a group of siblings would be the one in authority. But God says, in this case, the situation is going to be reversed. The younger's going to have more authority than the older. And this is how the story of Jacob and Esau plays out. But there is a time when Jacob submits himself to Esau because of different circumstances. But putting these four lines together, the point we should see from this verse about Rebekah is that she would give birth to two nations. Rebekah, in a sense, would become the mother of two separate nations, all through these two children she was going to have. Now, again, from later in Genesis, we know that those nations are the nations of Edom, the nations of Israel. So they'd be separated. One would become stronger than the other, and one would live in service to the other. Now, the fulfillment of God's words to Rebekah is primarily seen in some of the events that we read about in Exodus, in Numbers, 2 Samuel, and 1 Kings, just to name a few. Israel, at its source in Jacob, would become far more powerful than Edom, who had its source in Esau. Any other questions or comments on this verse? Yeah, that's true. Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. Um, Anything else on this verse? I can't imagine to begin to know what that feels like. I cannot pretend to know what that's like. I won't even venture to try. Um, so I respect you ladies for doing what you've done. Um, Anything else before we go to our last point? All right, let's go to Genesis 27, and we'll look at our last point about Rebekah. Now here the attention's going to shift a little bit. We're going to be looking at verses 15 through 17. If somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses. Genesis 27, 15 through 17. Thank you, Sandy. So the point we're going to be looking about Rebecca, we looked at some positive features about her. Here we're going to see a little bit of a negative aspect about herself, and that she played a role in Jacob's deception of Isaac. So in verse 15, the author records the first of 3 actions that Rebecca took in an effort to fulfill a plan that was made earlier in the chapter. The plan Rebecca made earlier in the chapter, Isaac has reached his old age. He can't see very well. He's nearing his death, and so he asked Esau to prepare for him a meal from game that he would go out and hunt, and that's something we read about in verses 1 through 4 of this chapter. Rebecca, she's within earshot of this conversation. So what she does, because she loves Jacob more than Esau, she hatches out this plan where Jacob would prepare his own meal, or Rebecca would prepare it for him, and Jacob would disguise himself as Esau, because the purpose in this is to steal the blessing that otherwise belonged to Esau. So in verse 15, we have step number 1. What does she do? Okay. And what else does she do according to this verse? Or wait, no, sorry, I'm thinking verse 16. Jumping ahead. Scratch that question. So, yes, she puts the best clothes of Esau on Jacob. I'd say went to his closet, takes the clothes, don't know what they look like, puts them on Jacob. So it's the first step in Jacob disguising himself as Esau. So we go to verse 16. What else does she do? Okay. Why would she do that? There it is. That is one difference we know between Jacob and Esau. Jacob had smooth skin. Esau was a very hairy person. So if Rebecca was going to pull off this plan successfully, this is something she had to do. Find a way to give Jacob hairy skin on these parts of his body that were exposed, his neck, his hands. So she's giving Jacob the appearance of Esau by doing what she does here. And what's the last thing she does in verse 17? Gave him the food and bread. She knows what Isaac is expecting. So she's taking all the steps. Here's the meal that your father wanted. So this is the culminating action in hers and Jacob's plan. Now Jacob's not excused at all. This is Rebekah's plan, but Jacob's also getting himself involved in this. He's basically going along with the plan. But this is the last step, the meal. But what Rebekah is doing here, she's providing a different meal for Jacob for the purpose of giving it to his father and further deceiving him into believing that he was Esau and not Jacob. But we're focusing on Rebekah. The point we should see about Rebekah from these verses is that she played a role in Jacob's deception of Isaac. So according to these verses, her role was such that she would make Jacob look like Esau, and the purpose of that was for Jacob to receive the blessing that belonged to Esau. Now Jacob, of course, would be just as guilty because he goes along with this plan instead of fighting against it. But it is Rebekah that initiated the plan. Questions or comments on this verse? These verses, I should say. All right. So we've looked at these 3 passages about Rebekah. She was a fallible woman, but she was still used by God. She was attractive, she was a generous servant, and she played a role in Jacob's deception of Isaac. We too are fallible people, but God can still use us. Now, in addition to Rebecca, God's word is filled with people who had their own set of shortcomings, but God still used them. So we should be encouraged by the fact that out of his great love for us, God still chooses to use us, even in spite of our own weaknesses. Now, one reason God does that is because he wants us to rely on him so that we might become strong in those areas where we are weak. Now, with that being the case, we should not be discouraged by our weaknesses, but instead be encouraged that God can make us strong in those areas where we are weak and use those weaknesses to his glory. Now, again, these are just some applications that we can take from what we've studied today. Any other questions or comments on anything? All right. Matt, will you close us out today?